Boy returns from death with a horrifying message from Jesus. Ethan was the kind of boy who could light up a room with his laughter. At just 11 years old, he had a boundless energy that kept everyone on their toes, especially his parents. His love for adventure often led him to explore beyond the boundaries of what was deemed safe. That summer, his family had planned a trip to a serene lakeside town, a much-needed escape from their busy city lives. Ethan was thrilled, imagining all the adventures he could have in the woods and on the water. His excitement was contagious, and even his older sister, who usually rolled her eyes at his antics, couldn't help but smile at his enthusiasm. The day of the accident was one that began like any other. Clear skies, the scent of pine trees, and the gentle lapping of waves against the shore. Ethan had convinced his parents to let him try paddleboarding on the lake. His father had smiled, proud of Ethan's fearless attitude, and reminded him to wear his life vest. Ethan had rolled his eyes in mock protest, but obeyed. As he paddled out into the shimmering water, the world felt alive. The sun reflected off the surface, creating a kaleidoscope of colors, and birds swooped low, their songs harmonizing with the rustling trees. But life has a way of changing in an instant. Without warning, a strong gust of wind swept across the lake, tilting Ethan's paddleboard and knocking him into the water. Normally, this wouldn't have been a problem. He was a decent swimmer, and he had his life vest. But as he surfaced, another gust pushed the paddleboard against his head with a sickening crack. The world around him spun, and the once vivid colors of the lake began to blur into a dark, swirling haze. His parents, watching from the shore, saw him go under. They screamed his name, their voices panicked and desperate. His father dove into the water while his mother fumbled to call for help, her hands shaking so badly that she could barely press the buttons on her phone. Time seemed to slow as the seconds dragged on with no sign of Ethan. When his father finally reached him and pulled him to the surface, Ethan's face was pale, his body limp. The ambulance arrived quickly, but to his parents it felt like an eternity. Paramedics worked tirelessly, shouting commands and performing CPR as they rushed him to the hospital. His mother held his hand the entire way, tears streaming down her face, begging him to wake up. But Ethan remained still, his chest rising and falling only with the help of the machines keeping him alive. In that moment, his family's world seemed to shatter. For Ethan, however, reality had shifted entirely. He wasn't in the ambulance, he wasn't in the hospital, he wasn't even in his body. Instead, he found himself weightless, suspended in a strange but comforting warmth. The pain from the accident was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of peace. At first, he couldn't see anything, just a soft, glowing light surrounding him. It felt as if he were being cradled by the very fabric of the universe. Gradually, the light began to take form, stretching out in front of him like a tunnel. The tunnel seemed infinite, and yet he felt drawn to it, as if it were calling to him. The whispers started then, soft and indistinct at first, like a gentle breeze carrying secrets. But as he floated closer to the light, the whispers became clearer. They weren't just sounds, they were words. Ethan couldn't understand them fully, but he felt their meaning deep within his soul. They spoke of love, of hope, of something greater than himself. The light grew brighter as he approached, but it wasn't blinding. It was warm and inviting, like the embrace of a loved one. Ethan felt no fear, only curiosity and a strange, unshakable sense of belonging. As he moved closer, he became aware of a presence, a being that radiated love and power in equal measure. He didn't need to ask who it was. He just knew. Jesus stood before him, though not in the way Ethan had ever imagined. He wasn't the solemn figure from paintings or the gentle shepherd from Sunday school stories. He was more than that, immeasurable in his kindness, his strength, and his authority. His eyes, deep and knowing, seemed to see every part of Ethan's soul, yet there was no judgment, only understanding. "Ethan," Jesus said, his voice resonating not just in the air, but within Ethan's very being. It was a voice that carried the weight of eternity, yet it was as gentle as a whisper. Ethan wanted to speak, to ask where he was, why he was here, but he found himself speechless in the presence of such overwhelming grace. Jesus smiled, a smile that seemed to light up the infinite space around them. "You've come far, but your journey is not over." Ethan didn't understand. He wanted to stay in this place where everything felt perfect, where there was no fear or pain. But as if reading his thoughts, Jesus placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "There is something you must know," Jesus continued, "a truth that will shape the world to come." His tone grew serious, though his warmth never wavered. "There is a name, a life that will intersect with yours and with many others. Baron Trump." The name echoed in the space around them, reverberating like a bell. Ethan's mind raced. Baron Trump? The boy he'd heard about in passing, someone he had never thought twice about? Why would Jesus speak of him? What could it possibly mean? Jesus didn't explain, at least not fully. Instead, he showed Ethan glimpses of something vast and incomprehensible. Flashes of people and places, moments of chaos and moments of peace. Ethan saw Baron Trump, older, standing at a crossroads with the weight of the world on his shoulders. Around him swirled both shadows and light, conflict and harmony. What Ethan saw was unclear, yet he knew it was important. "You will not understand everything now," Jesus said, his voice gentle but firm. "But when the time comes, you will remember, and you will know what to do." Ethan wanted to ask more, to stay in this place of warmth and clarity. But Jesus began to step back, the light growing brighter, almost engulfing him. "You are strong, Ethan," Jesus said, his words echoing as the tunnel began to pull away. "Do not be afraid. You are never alone." And with that, the light vanished. Ethan felt himself being pulled back, a sensation like falling, but not entirely unpleasant. Then, in an instant, the peace was gone, replaced by the harsh, sterile reality of the hospital room. Ethan lay in the hospital bed, his eyes fluttering open to the sterile white walls and the rhythmic beeping of machines around him. His head throbbed, his body felt heavy, but the memories of what he had just experienced burned vividly in his mind. It wasn't a dream, he was certain of that. Every word, every image, every sensation lingered as if imprinted on his very soul. But what did it mean? The name, the visions, the message. It was all too much for an 11-year-old boy to process. His parents rushed to his side, tears streaming down their faces. His mother's voice cracked as she called his name, stroking his hair as if afraid to let him go again. His father stood behind her, his hand on her shoulder, his eyes red and swollen. Ethan wanted to reassure them, to tell them he was okay, but his voice came out as little more than a rasp. Still, the relief in their eyes when they saw him awake was overwhelming. For a moment, the world around him felt normal again, as if he could forget the otherworldly encounter that had changed everything. But he couldn't forget, not for a second. The words Jesus spoke to him echoed in his mind, haunting and urgent. Baron Trump. He could still see the flashes of a future that didn't entirely make sense. Cities in turmoil, faces filled with both hope and despair, and at the center of it all, Baron Trump. Older, no longer the boy Ethan vaguely recognized from news clips, but a man surrounded by a swirl of both shadow and light. What was his role in this vision? Why had Jesus shown it to him? Ethan didn't tell his parents right away. How could he? How do you explain to anyone, even the people who love you most, that you met Jesus and were entrusted with a message that could change the course of history. He didn't even fully understand it himself. All he knew was that he had to tell someone eventually. Jesus had made that clear. The message wasn't just for him, it was for everyone. But how? How could an ordinary kid like him make people listen? The weight of the responsibility pressed on him, and for the first time, he felt afraid. Days passed, and Ethan's recovery astonished the doctors. They called it a miracle, unable to explain how he had come back from such a critical state with no lasting damage. The word miracle made Ethan's heart race every time he heard it. If only they knew. If only they could see what he had seen. But even as he considered sharing his experience, doubts crept in. Would anyone believe him? Would they think he was lying, or worse, that he'd lost his mind? The fear of being dismissed or ridiculed was paralyzing, but the memories wouldn't let him rest. At night he dreamt of the light, the tunnel, and Jesus' voice. The flashes of the future returned in fragmented pieces, always centered on Baron Trump. In the dreams, Ethan could feel the tension, the stakes of something much larger than himself. It wasn't just about one person, it was about everyone. The world seemed to hang in a delicate balance, and Ethan felt both the weight of its fragility and the hope that it could be saved. One evening, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his father entered the room. He sat on the edge of Ethan's bed, his expression serious yet gentle. "You've been quiet since the accident," he said softly. "I know something's on your mind. You can tell me, Ethan. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." Ethan hesitated, his heart pounding. This was his chance to say something, but the words felt too big, too overwhelming. I had a dream," he finally said, though he knew it wasn't really a dream. It was different. It felt real. His father nodded, encouraging him to continue. "What kind of dream?" Ethan took a deep breath. "I met someone important. He told me things about the future, about a boy named Baron Trump." The room fell silent. His father's brow furrowed, confusion flickering across his face. "Baron Trump?" he repeated, as if trying to place the name. "The president's son?" Ethan nodded, his voice trembling. "But he's not a boy in the future. He's a man, and he's important. I don't know how, but he is. And Jesus said I have to tell people that it matters." His father stared at him, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Ethan feared he'd said too much, that his father would dismiss him, or, worse, think he was losing his grip on reality. But then his father placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You've been through something incredible, Ethan," he said carefully. "I don't know what it all means, but I believe you believe it, and maybe that's what matters." Ethan felt a small flicker of relief, but his father's measured words only underscored the enormity of what he faced. Convincing his father was one thing. Convincing the world? That was something else entirely. The following days were filled with strange coincidences that Ethan couldn't ignore. News stories about Baron Trump seemed to pop up everywhere. Articles about his childhood, speculation about his future, and even conspiracy theories that linked him to bizarre prophecies. Ethan hadn't paid attention to any of it before, but now it felt as if the universe was forcing him to take notice. It was as if the world itself was weaving together pieces of a puzzle he didn't yet understand. Ethan began to talk more, first to his parents and then to a few close friends. Each time, he felt the same mixture of relief and fear. Some listened with open hearts, curious and even moved by his story. Others were skeptical, offering polite smiles or outright disbelief. The reactions stung, but Ethan reminded himself of what Jesus had said. The message wouldn't be easy to share, and not everyone would accept it. Still, he pressed on, knowing that the vision wasn't his to keep hidden. One night, as he lay awake, staring at the stars through his bedroom window, Ethan thought of Jesus' final words to him. "You are strong, Ethan. Do not be afraid. You are never alone." They repeated in his mind like a mantra, a promise that he clung to when doubt threatened to consume him. Even in his darkest moments, he could feel the faintest glow of the light he had seen, a reminder that his journey was far from over. Ethan's time in the glowing presence of Jesus felt infinite, yet fleeting. The peace, the warmth, the overwhelming love. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced on earth. He wanted to stay there forever, wrapped in that light, free from fear and uncertainty. But deep down he knew this wasn't his place, not yet. As much as his soul yearned to remain, the weight of the message Jesus had given him reminded him that his journey wasn't over. Still, the idea of returning to the world, where confusion, doubt, and pain awaited, filled him with dread. "I don't want to go back," Ethan said, his voice trembling. His words seemed small compared to the vastness of the space around him, but Jesus heard them as if they were the only sound that mattered. He looked at Ethan with a kindness that seemed to pour directly into his heart. "I know," Jesus replied, his voice both gentle and firm, "but your time has not yet come. There is more for you to do." Ethan felt tears welling up in his eyes. What if I can't do it? What if no one believes me? Jesus knelt, bringing himself to Ethan's level. His gaze was steady, and when he spoke, it was with an authority that left no room for doubt. "You are stronger than you know, Ethan. You were chosen for this because you have the courage to speak even when it is hard. You will face resistance, but remember, I am always with you. You are never alone." The words filled Ethan with a warmth that steadied his fear, though the thought of leaving still ached. Jesus placed a hand on his shoulder, and Ethan felt a surge of strength, as if a piece of the light itself was being left within him. Then, slowly, the brilliant surroundings began to fade, replaced by a growing darkness. "Wait!" Ethan cried out, desperate to hold on to the moment. "I don't understand everything yet. What if I mess up?" Jesus' voice echoed as the light pulled away. "You will know what to do when the time comes. Trust in me, Ethan." And then it was gone. The warmth, the light, the presence, it all vanished in an instant. Ethan felt himself being dragged through a void, a sensation like falling and then pain. His chest ached, his head throbbed, and the air felt heavy in his lungs. His senses returned in a chaotic rush as the sterile smell of the hospital filled his nostrils and the sound of beeping monitors reached his ears. The first thing he saw was his mother's tear-streaked face hovering over him. "Ethan!" she sobbed, clutching his hand tightly. His father stood just behind her, his expression a mix of shock and joy. Nurses and doctors crowded the room, their voices a blur of medical jargon and exclamations about his recovery. Ethan blinked, disoriented, his mind struggling to reconcile the divine experience he had just left with the stark, cold reality of the hospital. His mother kissed his forehead, her hands trembling. "You're back," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're really back." Ethan wanted to tell her everything about Jesus, the light, the message, but he couldn't find the words. His throat was dry, his voice weak, and the weight of what he had experienced was too enormous to put into simple explanations. Instead, he squeezed her hand and nodded, his eyes glistening with unspoken understanding. In the days that followed, Ethan's recovery was nothing short of miraculous. Doctors were baffled by how quickly he healed, especially considering the severity of his injuries. "It's like he's been touched by an angel," one nurse commented, and Ethan couldn't help but smile faintly at the truth hidden in her words. But while his body grew stronger, his mind was consumed by the task ahead. How was he supposed to share what he had experienced? And more importantly, how could he make people believe it? The first person he confided in was his mother. Late one night, when the house was quiet and the shadows stretched long across the walls, he found her sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. She looked up as he entered, her eyes soft with concern. "Can't sleep?" she asked, gesturing for him to sit beside her. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. He slid into the chair, the words building inside him like a storm. Finally, he took a deep breath and said, "Mom, something happened to me when I was gone." Her brow furrowed slightly, but she didn't interrupt. Ethan told her everything about the tunnel of light, meeting Jesus, and the message about Baron Trump. He spoke haltingly at first, but as the story poured out of him, he found himself unable to stop. His mother listened intently, her expression shifting from confusion to awe to something that resembled fear. When he finished, there was a long silence. Ethan's heart raced, his palms sweating as he waited for her response. Would she think he was crazy? Would she dismiss it as a dream? Finally, she reached out and took his hand. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice trembling, "I don't know what this all means, but I believe you. You've been through something extraordinary. Maybe this is something bigger than any of us can understand right now." Her words brought a wave of relief, but they also reinforced the enormity of his responsibility. This wasn't just about his experience. It was about the message, the warning, and the hope he had been entrusted with. The next step was even harder. Ethan began sharing his story with others, first with his father, then with a few close friends. Some listened with open hearts, moved by the sincerity in his voice. Others were skeptical, offering polite nods or outright dismissing him. One friend even laughed, saying, "You've been watching too many movies, Ethan." The rejection stung, but Ethan reminded himself of Jesus' words. Not everyone would believe, and that was okay. His job wasn't to force people to accept the message, it was simply to share it. As time went on, word of Ethan's story began to spread. His parents were hesitant at first, worried about how the attention might affect him, but Ethan was determined. This wasn't about him, it was about something much bigger. Soon, local news outlets picked up the story, and people from all over began reaching out, some curious, others desperate for answers. Ethan felt the pressure mounting, but he also felt the faint glow of the light within him, a reminder of the strength Jesus had given him. One day, as he sat in his room staring at a journal where he had started recording his memories of the experience, he felt a sense of clarity. This was only the beginning. The message Jesus had given him wasn't just about Baron Trump, it was about hope, faith, and the power of standing up for what is right, even in the face of doubt. Ethan didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for certain. His journey was far from over, and he would see it through no matter where it led. As Ethan's story began to circulate, the reactions from the world around him were as varied as the stars in the night sky. Some people called him a miracle, a chosen one sent to deliver a divine message. Others dismissed him entirely, calling his experience a figment of a traumatized imagination or the fantastical dreams of a young boy recovering from near death. It didn't matter to Ethan which side people chose. The message Jesus had entrusted to him wasn't about convincing everyone. It was about reaching those who were ready to listen. But Ethan wasn't prepared for how quickly his story gained traction. At first it was small, a neighbor mentioning his name at church, a family friend sharing the story with a co-worker. Then a local reporter caught wind of his experience and wrote a feature on him. The article focused on Ethan's miraculous recovery, but also hinted at the larger, mysterious vision he claimed to have had. The story spread like wildfire, and soon Ethan found himself at the center of a whirlwind. His family's phone rang constantly, with reporters and strangers alike asking for interviews or more details about his vision. Some wanted answers, others wanted to debunk him. His parents did their best to shield him from the chaos, but Ethan insisted on talking to those who were genuinely curious. "If just one person listens," he told his father one night, "then it's worth it." Among those who reached out were pastors, spiritual leaders, and even scientists intrigued by his account. They asked him about the tunnel of light, about his encounter with Jesus, and most of all, about the mysterious name, Baron Trump. Ethan did his best to explain, though even he struggled to fully articulate what he had seen. The name carried weight, that much he knew, but its full meaning was still veiled in mystery. He often felt like a piece of a larger puzzle, one that hadn't yet revealed its full picture. The media coverage brought both support and criticism. Some people rallied behind him, calling him a prophet for a new generation. Others accused him of making up the story for attention, or speculated that his parents were behind it, seeking fame. The scrutiny was exhausting, but Ethan tried to stay focused on the message, even as doubt began to creep into his own mind. What if he had misunderstood? What if he had failed to convey the urgency of what Jesus had shown him? Then, something strange happened. Ethan began noticing subtle shifts in the world around him. News about Baron Trump started surfacing in unexpected ways. People began discussing him, not just as the son of a former president, but as someone who seemed destined for something greater. Articles speculated about his future, and conspiracy theories swirled about his potential influence on the world. Some called him a prodigy, while others painted him as a figure shrouded in mystery and power. Ethan couldn't ignore the eerie parallels between these discussions and the visions Jesus had shown him. The more Ethan saw, the more he realized that his role wasn't just to deliver the message, it was to prepare people for what was coming. Baron Trump wasn't just a name or a person, he was a symbol of something larger. The visions Jesus had shared showed a world on the brink of chaos and transformation, and Ethan knew that Baron was somehow tied to it all. But was he the catalyst for the chaos, or the one who would help heal it? That answer remained out of reach. Ethan decided to keep a journal, writing down everything he remembered from his encounter with Jesus. The images, the words, the emotions, they all poured onto the pages. He began to see patterns in the fragments of his memory, connections between the visions and the world around him. The journal became a lifeline, a way to process the enormity of his experience and prepare himself for what lay ahead. As months turned into years, Ethan's life returned to a semblance of normalcy, though he was forever changed by what had happened. He grew stronger, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. He learned to face the skeptics with grace and to embrace those who believed in his story. He began speaking at small gatherings, sharing his experience and encouraging others to have faith, even in the darkest times. Then, one day, the pieces began to fall into place. News broke of Baron Trump stepping into the public eye, not as a figure of controversy, but as a leader. He spoke with a calm authority that surprised many and seemed to carry a message of unity and hope. Ethan watched the coverage, his heart pounding as he recognized the man from his visions. It was as if the world itself had reached the crossroads Jesus had shown him, and Baron was at the center of it all. The world didn't change overnight. There was still division, still conflict, still uncertainty. But Ethan saw glimmers of the light he had felt in Jesus' presence, a sense that hope was not lost, that humanity could find its way back to the love and unity it was meant for. He realized that his role hadn't been to change the world directly, but to plant seeds of faith and courage in those who would. As he reflected on everything that had happened, Ethan felt a deep sense of peace. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew he had done what Jesus had asked of him. The message had been shared, and the rest was in God's hands. Whatever came next, Ethan was ready to face it with the strength and faith that had carried him through. Years later, as he looked back on his journey, Ethan couldn't help but smile. He had gone from being a carefree boy to carrying the weight of a divine message, and through it all, he had learned one simple truth. Even in the face of the unknown, love and faith would always light the way forward. And as the world continued its journey, Ethan remained a quiet but steadfast reminder of the light that had touched him and the hope it offered to everyone.